All right, my name's Tyler Bowman. My Opus number is 1267568. I'm currently housed at Nash Correctional in Nashville, North Carolina. You can reach me out through GTL Getting Out app, text behind, or Tyler writes it down at gmail.com. I just wanted to use this open mic opportunity to talk a little bit about the type of people that are behind bars, that are in prison, that society might not be aware of, that don't fit the mold, don't fit the stereotype that is perpetuated by the media, the public, Hollywood, and kind of humanize us a little bit. And to do that, I'm just going to, talk about myself in that regard. And, and so to that note, there's a lot of writers in prison. And, not just the kind of writers that write pen pals and letters and, letters to their lawyer and harassing prison legal services and stuff. There's genuine writers that try to hone the craft, that take themselves serious, take the craft serious, and try to build a career in here, on that. And in the midst of joining that community myself, I've written, a few articles through Dollars and Cents that highlight the prison culture, some of the common issues that we come across, whether it's forced labor versus forced idleness, whether it's the lack of education or the limitations of the education that is available to people with long sentences. And so I decided to write about these issues because they impacted me. And in the midst of that, again, I honed my craft, learned to do a little journalism, and, really found a passion in writing, really found a passion in sharing my voice. And I know not all of my peers know how to do that and do that well. And so I feel like it's kind of a responsibility. And a lot of people in this community that are able to do that feels like it's their responsibility as well to try to impact and change the narrative that's out there. Again, I think it's important that society or the audience of this podcast knows that a lot of people in prison that have exceptionally long sentences were sentenced as either juveniles or young adults or what's called emerging adults, and they didn't really know what they didn't know. And as they grow up and mature and start listening and developing, then they become aware of what the world is really like. But unfortunately, they grow this awareness in prison, and so they learn these skills, they hone their craft, and unfortunately, their voices are muffled because we're behind bars or you're having to handwrite this, that, and the third. But there are people that are actively pursuing an education. There are people that are actively pursuing a trade in prison, and these guys that get locked up at a young age, they didn't know this stuff out there in the world, and you learn it in here, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of scenarios to apply this knowledge. And what you have is, by the state's definition, which is vocational and academic education, what you have is you have genuine rehabilitation taking place that's not being talked about, that light is not being shed on these individuals. And fortunately, there's outlets such as Behind Bars podcast that, can give voice to these people. But, these people are being rehabilitated. And right now, as North Carolina law currently stands, there is no window of hope to try to get out early, try to grasp what little bit of life remains from them, or try to earn their life back. North Carolina doesn't incentivize individuals to get an education. They don't incentivize people to maintain a job or to do good. And what they call incentives are easily taken away, and at the end of the day, the offender still has to do a mandatory minimum. North Carolina is one of a handful of states that still is on the mandatory minimum, and they're kind of lagging behind in that regard. And so one of the organizations out there, which is Sentenced Too Young, who's in the process of going from .org to .com, is trying to address and educate.
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
Inform the public that, individuals in prison are taking it upon themselves because there's very little to no incentive to change and to change for the better. So these people are pursuing education. These people are pursuing faith-based groups, or they're pursuing, exercise and training their minds, training their bodies, and training their spirits, all through self-motivation, all through pursuit of, just becoming a better image bearer, a better person in general. And again, it's not for any ulterior motive other than just being a better human being. And so what you have is when you are young and you've been either brainwashed by the people around you, substance abuse, the music you listen to, the negative influences in your life, and you've been brainwashed, become a product of your environment, and then you come to prison and you experience a lot of that same reality, if not even more compounded in this environment. And so in the midst of that, if you are able, I call it stepping out of the box of ignorance. If a light bulb is able to go off in your head and you're able to make the conscious decision to change in the midst of an environment that does not support change for the positive, in the midst of an environment where even administration hinders that change or views your change as an alternative motive just to try to get out of prison early or to try to work the system or anything like that, and therefore becomes a hindrance, and you take it upon yourself to still pursue that path. I mean, these are strong individuals in here that are taking it upon themselves to be rehabilitated, and Sentence Too Young works to highlight those individuals. And again, it covers what they're trying to address is the group of individuals between the age of 18 and 25 who society is essentially tossed away, who advocates for prison reform haven't, fully shined their light on yet, although some states are starting to pass legislation, propose legislation in regards to this issue. But this emerging adult category, 18 to 25, where neuroscientists, where experts in the field, where science has proven that, human beings, male and female, continue to develop into their early to mid-20s, and, it drastically affects their prefrontal cortex where, the decision-making and risk-weighing processes take place. And, a lot of science backs it up. It's been going on for decades now. Cases all the way back to the late 90s, early 2000s refer to these studies for juvenile laws that have been changed. But unfortunately, what legislators are doing is they're putting they're putting a plug on it at 18 when the science actually pertains to people up to the age of 25. That's a more realistic cutoff as opposed to just the arbitrary number of 18 because that's when society says you're an adult. Yes, but society also says you have to be 21 when you drink, 21 when you smoke, now 25 to rent a car, to obtain certain types of insurance. So there's other aspects of society that already recognize this disparity, this difference in the stages of development. And there is an organization out there called the MacArthur Network that is made up of judges, made up of neuroscientists and policymakers that are tasked with trying to figure out how to apply this science to the everyday world, to different areas of society, and where it's not being implemented at and where it should be implemented at the most is in the criminal justice system. I mean, it would account for why people do what they do and why crime is so rampant in juveniles and the emerging adults. Science shows, statistics show that people tend to age out of crime. So when a 20, 22-year-old, even 25-year-old or 18-year-old come to prison, they do 20 years in prison, so they've physically developed. Now, if there's programs in place that they can take advantage of, or say there were programs that incentivize people to go get a bachelor's degree or a master's degree, and in 20 years we'll let you out, then not only have you educated them and prepared them for society, but they've also aged out of crime. Their risk-taking and their decision-making process, their prefrontal cortex has fully developed, and you've essentially nurtured that individual for 20 years or however long their sentence is with a prison system that's conducive to genuine change. Right now, our prison system is not conducive to genuine change. Our laws are not structured to incentivize people to pursue that route. And so North Carolina, among other states, is lagging behind in that regard, and sentenced too young. That's why I respect Michelle. She is a champion. She is an advocate. And you know, she's trying to network with legislators on both sides of the aisle because it is a bipartisan issue. This is a societal issue. This is an American issue. And
You have 60 seconds remaining.
you need to acknowledge the fact that young adults should be sentenced differently than fully matured adults, just like juveniles need to be sentenced differently than young adults. There should be 3 sentencing categories, essentially. But so on the Sentence Too Young website, there is a section for blogs, and that's where myself and many of my peers who have exhibited genuine change have put their testimonies of their change, how we went from being juvenile or emerging adults that thought we had the world figured out, we're kind of stuck in our ways, to where, you know, a catalyst ended up being introduced into our lives, whether it was prison or something that happened in prison that sparked the change, whether it was something secular or spiritual. And from there, who we are now, you know, how we would describe ourselves now and what we hope to achieve with this newfound purpose. And what I've discovered from living with a lot of like-minded individuals, I'm in a college program right now, so I'm surrounded by a lot of guys who have been incarcerated for a long time that came in, you know, around the age that I did, which was 22. Some of them came in younger, some of them came in a little bit older. But all the ones that I've met who are pursuing this path of education have fundamentally changed. I mean, you can see it in their hearts, you can see it in their eyes, and you can see it in the way they speak, the way they move, and the way they carry themselves, the way they live their lives. You know, they try to be role models for some of the other individuals. And, you know, if we could cultivate the people that are already taking the initiative to do that, and if we can multiply that and again, you know, provide a system that nurtures that, then, you know, it'd be like cells growing in a petri dish. I mean, it would just grow exponentially. And
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
take your average Joe in prison, you know, they may or may not have their GED. That's one of the main programs in prison is for a person to, you know, obtain their GED, but there's very limited post-secondary education. And, you know, that could help an individual. You know, again, somebody doesn't know what they don't know. Just like prior to me coming to Nash, I was in closed custody where there was not a lot going on. Everybody was locked down a lot. I get to Nash, and there's people here that are writing books. I had just finished my first novel, so it's very ironic. I just came out with my first novel, Legacy of Stars. I get here. It's a camp full of authors. It's a camp full of journalists. They have their own facility publication, which I'm now a part of. They have their own. The North Carolina just started its own statewide prison publication called North Carolina Prison News Today, which I'm also involved with, and they just came out with their second issue. And so there's a lot going on here, not to mention 2 of the guys here when I first got here had written legislation that's been coming up now that most guys in prison are familiar with, which is the Prison Resource Repurposing Act, and they wrote that from in prison. And they've garnered a lot of support for it, and since it's initially been proposed, you know, it keeps coming up every couple of years and being proposed, and hopefully with that, it'll bring parole back, which is, again, something else North Carolina should strongly consider. And that correlates perfectly with whether you're a juvenile, whether you're an emerging adult. And what that does is it allows the state to look at you again to assess what you've been doing with your life since your incarceration, and have you taken the initiative to try to change? Have you pursued what limited programs are available? Have you even done that? So, it's something that would benefit the population. It's something that would benefit the system as a whole. The state's having a hard time keeping, the prison staffed. I mean, eventually something's going to have to be addressed. Not sure what that's going to take the form of. Unfortunately, this year, the General Assembly, there were quite a few, a dozen, maybe more, pieces of prison reform legislation that were proposed, and which is a significant amount compared to the last General Assembly, I believe. And unfortunately, they're either just kind of dead in the water, and unless a miracle happens. But unfortunately, we haven't been able to get the GOP involved with prison reform when it's really an issue, again, that's bipartisan. It's an issue that would behoove them to address because, again, it's good for society, it's good for the system, it's good for the people that live here, but it's also good for the people that work here, bringing in this systemic change that would create safer environments and an environment that's conducive to, again, rehabilitation, where, when these people return to society, that people are comfortable with them being their neighbors. And my question has kind of always been, why is that not the system that already exists? Why do we have a punitive justice system where our idea of justice is just throwing somebody in a cage and, let God sort them out, when, 95, 96% of people that are incarcerated return to society one day? And we're doing nothing to prepare them for that return, or what we are doing is very little. We're dehumanizing people while they're in prison. These are human beings. We're dehumanizing for the 5, 10, 20, however many years they're incarcerated, and then we expect them to come back out into society and pick up their lives like nothing's happened, to return to normal citizens like they didn't just go through a traumatic experience. And now they're forever defined by their worst decisions. And so, again, it's not, it's not ignoring victims' rights. It's not, discounting the legal system that we have. What it is doing a justice to society. It's doing justice to victims, especially if North Carolina was to implement some kind of restorative justice process. There's a lot of options that are available. I mean, what is being proposed by organizations in North Carolina, such as Senate Too Young, or individuals, what's being proposed as solutions is nothing that's reinventing the wheel. These are solutions that have already been proposed and passed in other states, and that's whether you're talking about juvenile, whether you're talking about emerging adults, whether you're talking about modern-day slavery, any of these issues where you're talking about, humanitarian rights or just basic living conditions. I mean, again, we're in a system that varies with state prisons. We're in a system that varies from state to state so much. And time and again, unfortunately, North Carolina has been a laggard in a lot of the legislation and a lot of the decisions they make within the criminal justice system. And, it would be refreshing for that culture to change. I know they're trying to change the culture in prison, but I know that there's a lot of people in prison and out that's trying to change the culture of legislators as well, on how, they determine whether or not an individual is fit to return to society. One of the things that North Carolina does is...
This call is from a North Carolina correctional facility.
They have a sentencing commission that comes out with a report every year that predicts how likely people are to come back to prison, how likely recidivism is to occur. And they've been pretty accurate for the past few years with their reports. And the risk factors they take into consideration is age, gender, your current crime, and prior arrest. I mean, these are pretty predictable elements, and their predictions correlate fairly closely with actual results. And it's more violent offenses is B1 class felonies to like D or E class felonies that have the lowest recidivism rate. And a lot of these young guys that come in that get these life sentences, that get these 20, 30, 40 years in prison at the age of 18 or 20, and they're the ones that are least likely to come back to prison when they do get out. These violent crimes, they tend to do so much time that they age out of crime. They learn their lessons, but with these predictions, these factors that they have, these categories, these risk assessments they place people into, if they're so accurate with them, why not, run those predictions sooner on the actual population, not the people that are currently getting out of prison, and start seeing if you can't accurately predict people that you can let out sooner, which would tie into parole, which would tie into emerging adult and more juvenile legislation. I mean, they have their fingertips. The state of North Carolina has their fingertips on all this data, all this information, and they're focused right now on Reentry 2030, which is this whole reentry plan for North Carolina to boost up its reentry infrastructure to really help the people in their last couple years of incarceration, which is great. I believe that needs to exist. I think it should have existed sooner. What I think they can do is, if they create that pipeline for reentry, then start reducing people's sentences to get them in that pipeline sooner. People that, have been assessed as low risk, start getting them in this reentry pipeline sooner and get them out of prison sooner. Have them pay their debt to society. It's always going to be subjective. But have them pay their debt to society, but sentencing these kids, sentencing these underdeveloped kids to, just the rest of their life in prison is not conducive to justice being meted out. I mean, it's not. If society doesn't get the most out of this individual, they're forever burdened until that person dies in prison or does 40 years in prison. Society has to pay that debt. Their taxes go to maintaining this individual's life behind bars, where that individual, if properly nurtured and built up and educated while in prison, can get out, return to society, be a tax-paying citizen, and actually contribute. And so, again, it's just trying to share the other side of the narrative. And no, not everybody needs to be out of prison. Prison exists for a reason. But there needs to be a process, whether it's parole or some other kind of review board, to start assessing these people that are incarcerated that have a realistic shot of returning to society and contributing. And they've touted their predictions for recidivism for years now, and they've been pretty accurate. So they should be able to pretty accurately predict as well who is, ready to return to society, who they feel like they could prepare realistically for a return to society. And not only that, create a prison system where people are treated like humans. And until we do that, until society and the people that work in these prisons start viewing us as humans, legislators, policymakers, then, it's going to be an uphill battle for a long time. But it seems like we might be headed in the right direction. There are some NCDAC, North Carolina Department of Adult Corrections, employees that have been kind of switched around. We have a new governor. So there's hope. There's a lot of hope in the air for the guys that are in prison. And, we're not the most political types, but we keep up with politics. We're not the most, legalistic types, but we keep up with laws. When it pertains to our lives, we try to stay on top of it. And, we're not a bunch of dummies in here. I mean, we are, second-class citizens according to society, but we are first-class human beings. And, I just want, with my open mic, I just want people to understand that there are humans in prison, and there are people that have gotten their lives together, that society would be better having them out there than in here, and they could contribute. And, the sooner people realize that, then I think, genuine change